morning, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to our webinar today. My name is Brian, and for those of you who don't know about us, we are a government-owned organization in Singapore that invests in and helps to build deep tech startups, talent, and communities. At SGInnovate, our work involves connecting with the global deep tech ecosystem, working with entrepreneurial scientists to bring their innovative research from lab to market, as well as developing deep tech talent. Today's event is presented by SGInnovate and the NUS Faculty of Law in support of SGInnovate's Deep Tech for Good initiative. So today we have a very exciting event. We have a panel of amazing experts who will be debating the motion AI should be regulated by industry, not government. I would like to encourage our audience here today to share their thoughts on this topic and engage with our speakers by using the Q&A tab below. And with no further ado, I'll now pass the time to our moderator for today, Simon. Simon, please.
Thanks very much, Brian. And I'll ask my panelists to reveal their faces to you, if they would. It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you this morning, or indeed this afternoon or this evening, depending on where you're tuning in from. So my name's Simon Chessman. I'm Dean of the National University of Singapore Faculty of Law. I also wear a hat as Director of AI Governance at AI Singapore. And the topic for today is something that has been increasingly important, I think, realized around the world, the question of whether, how, and in particular, when and who should regulate artificial intelligence. I mean, it's kind of shocking that for most of the history of artificial intelligence over the last half century or more, we didn't really get much beyond Isaac Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. And I assume if you're watching this, you might have read some of Asimov. And the problem with people relying on his 3 laws of robotics is that if they'd actually worked, his literary career would have been brief. Most of his best stories are about how those laws didn't work. But in the last 5 years in particular, from around 2016, we have seen a proliferation of efforts to come up with guides, frameworks, principles. We've had Singapore's Model AI Governance Framework prominent among them. But we've had a real sort of hesitation about going down the path of hard regulation by government. Singapore, when it reviewed the penal code a couple of years back, explicitly concluded we would not impose criminal law restrictions on AI for fear of driving innovation elsewhere. China, in its AI strategy, said, yes, we need regulation of AI, maybe in 2025 or beyond. But this year we did see the EU put down a marker saying that they've adopted a draft regulation on artificial intelligence. And so today we're coming at this topic, and we've got 4 great speakers, but we're doing things a little bit differently. Rather than just having presentations, we thought we'd have it in a debate format. And rather than just getting people to defend their interests, we actually said, look, what would you like to argue for? And one of the things that was really interesting is in a couple of cases, it was the government that said, government representatives that said, no, we think industry should take the lead. Whereas industry time said, no, we think government should take the lead. I'll introduce our panelists in just a moment, but first I do want to get a baseline reading from our audience. And so there is a class participation component to today's assessment for all of you. So what I'd like you to do is this should have just popped up on your screen. Do you agree with the motion that AI should be regulated by industry, not government? Please do vote. And I'll come back to the results of that vote in just a minute. But let me introduce our panelists while you're tossing a coin or deciding which hat you want to throw your lot in with. So on the for side, we're going to have our first speaker will be Li Wanxi. She is the Director of Artificial Intelligence and Data Innovation at the Info Communications Media Development Authority, IMDA, right here in Singapore. Joining her, he will be speaking third, is Associate Professor Daniel Ting Shu Wei, who is the Director of Singapore Health Service AI Program and the Head of AI and Digital Innovation at the Singapore Eye Research Institute, or SERI. On the against side, we have Marcus Bartley-Johns, the Regional Director of Government Affairs and Public Policy at Microsoft, an example of someone on the industry side saying, no, we think government should take the lead. And Sopnendu Mohanty, who's the Chief FinTech Officer at the Monetary Authority of Singapore. So we've got 4 wonderful speakers. We're trying to sort of liven this up rather than just yet another Zoom webinar. So that's why we've gone with the debate format. We're going to have short 5-minute maximum presentations from our speakers. But before we go to them, so that we have a baseline, I do want to get from our organizers, the initial response to that first question, who do you think should take the lead? Do you agree AI should be regulated by industry? Okay, so the proposition have their work cut out for them. We have a sort of 2-to-1 almost, almost 2-to-1 believing in the opposition. So this is a kind of handicapping. So the question we're going to ask you at the very end, we'll ask you 2 questions. We'll ask you, firstly, have you changed your mind? And then secondly, who do you think made the better argument? So at the moment, I think the proposition know they've got their work cut out for them. And so without any further ado, starting that uphill battle, it's my delight to ask Li Wanxi to give us her thoughts on why AI should be regulated by industry, not government, and why 2/3 of you in the audience are wrong. Wanxi, over to you.
Thanks, Simon. So I'm one of those from the government who basically say, oh, let's make this interesting. I shall go on the proposition side and talk about why the industry should do this. I think mostly because also I was trying to come up with some perspectives on the different roles of government and industry in this space, because I think it's very important to that all of us play our part in the area of AI governance. And if we define regulations broadly, then actually there are many different roles that government and industry can play, and we can cooperate in that space. But right now, I think let's define regulations narrowly so that it's easier for me to make my argument as a proposition. But before I get there, I work in IMDA. I'm the director in charge of trusted AI and data, and primarily my job actually is to look at regulating AI at a horizontal level across different sectors. We have put out some work around detailed guidance. Simon mentioned the Model AI Governance Framework and some of the related work in that space. And we are studying what are some of the areas that we have to step up on to do more in this space. So, okay, let's talk about why the industry should be the ones driving AI governance, or in this case, regulating AI governance, regulating AI. I think we all agree in this forum that it's important to regulate, right? Because we want to be able to make sure that even as AI develops, right, there is we do not introduce harm to consumers. We must make sure that we protect them. These are consumers that may not know when they're interacting with AI system, may not know when decisions are made on their behalf. When an AI, let's say, decides to hire someone or decides not to hire someone. For example, those are some cases, real life cases, right, where recruitment is done by AI systems based on certain factors, and the consumers may not know. So it is important, I think, to regulate. The question that I have for myself is whether we are ready to regulate from the government perspective, or should the industry actually be driving this for the time being? So it's really the issue of timing and the state and speed of tech development for AI. So I want to qualify that yes, the government should do its job. Then the question is whether or not now is the time, and what can we do in the meantime? So why should the industry take the lead for now? Because number one, AI is a very fast developing area. There are many new advancements in AI on a very regular basis. And industry actually is at the forefront. They're the ones using it. They're the ones adopting it. They're the ones putting it into their systems. So it's important that the industry then be able to understand what they need to do in this space in terms of implementing responsible AI, because then they'll also be much more responsive to the changes of technology. And this is something that one of my fellow panelists on the pro side will talk about it in a little bit more detail. Actually, Daniel will talk about it in a little bit more detail. It's actually technical expertise is required, right? And at this stage in time, actually, industry is a lot more familiar with the technology in terms of and developing practices. So we should rely on the industry to set the standards, to build capability in this area before we actually decide how we want to regulate. And for us also, it's important to have industry participate at this stage, because you get more buy-in and adoption. For the government to regulate, we were thinking very hard about this, and we looked at EU, right? When they introduced the Draft AI Act in April. And one of the questions we asked ourselves with all these requirements was, how is EU going to enforce? And actually, they will take a while before they actually pass the act into law. I think it'll at least take a couple of years because they have to build out the enforcement mechanisms. So it's important then, right now, for the regulation to be effective, the government must be able to enforce, and I don't think we're ready to do that yet. So we still have to rely on industry's good practices to implement responsible AI. And then finally, if you look at what are some of the drivers for industry to put in place AI governance, it's not just about the government's mandate, but it's also other areas such as consumers relying on the industry to do what's right because they also vote with their wallets, right? Or shareholders and board members and some of the new emerging ESG practices that requires the industry to put in place good technology governance. So these are some of the drivers in which we can think of why industry is actually well placed to regulate AI. But like I said earlier, government regulation will come later. It's just not yet. And will come later when the standards are more established, when the technology is clearer, when the regulations are also clearer with much less conceptual issues to be dealt with. So what do we do in the meantime, right? And I think if you broaden the concept of what regulation is beyond just legislation, right? Regulation can have soft measures to hard measures, right? And this is where I think the collaboration with industry is important. The government can work with the industry to look at some of the implementing more detailed guidance that can be adopted by companies. We can bring together different partners, set the direction, organize a consensus of where we want to go. We can work with other international companies as well as other countries to make sure that it's done harmonizations of approaches and standards. So that's the role of the government. And where the role of industry is, then it's really to be the early adopters of AI governance, provide feedback, ideas to the government on what to do. We can sandbox regulatory approaches, and that's something that we're doing, for example, with Facebook Open Loop project. And to me, then, and to sum up, right, I think collaboration is really, really very important in this space that's emerging. Industry's role is important right now because they are the ones that know the technology. They are the ones who can adopt. They're the ones who can give feedback. The government's role is important to sort of corral and bring together the different aspects and provide the direction. And that's why we are working from IMDA, just to put a little quick plug there here, working very closely with the industry in developing the next area. And the next area is really looking at how do we provide testing and conformity assessment in order for companies to be a lot more transparent about its AI governance implementation. Because once you have that, then we can start looking at subsequently enforcement. And if we can look at enforcement, then we can start looking at regulations in a bit more detail. So that's all I have for now. I think my 5 minutes is up. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Wansi. Clearly a high school debating champion. Those of you taking notes, in addition to the substance, you will have seen what she did with the topic, define regulation broadly. So government just does the direction, but industry is much more closely situated, and define it by timing, saying, I'm only talking about now. I'm not saying never get government involved. So we go to our first opposition speaker, Marcus. Can you tell us why Wansi is completely wrong? Marcus, over to you.
Thanks, Simon. Well, I'm about to fail your high school debating class because I'm going to say Wansi's made a lot of very good points and I was listening very carefully. But look, I want to talk for a couple of minutes about why regulation is essential for promoting AI adoption while ensuring that this emerging technology is trusted. And that's going to be the best way of ensuring the growth of AI across the region and the world in a sustainable way, which is all about social license and trust. And I think there are 3 reasons I want to touch on. The first is we need regulation to prevent harms that could be caused by AI, particularly in high-risk contexts. The reality is most uses of AI are relatively low risk. There's AI powering features within Microsoft Outlook, for example, which hundreds of millions of people use every day to suggest what documents might be relevant for your next meeting. That's a use of AI that is relatively low risk and unlikely to result in harm. But we know there are uses of AI that can cause harm to individuals, and they should be the focus for regulation. Clear regulatory guardrails are really important there to prevent those potential harms. For me, a really strong example of that is looking at what's been happening on facial recognition around the world. We've seen bans or moratoria put on the use of facial recognition in a number of local governments in the United States. We've seen debate on that in the European Parliament in Europe. And that's triggered by a concern from citizens that this is a technology that could result in harms, particularly in a law enforcement context. but there's not a confidence that the right regulatory guardrails are in place. So it's an example of where regulation is needed so that there's not a very strong reaction to ban a specific use of AI technology instead of working out what are the guardrails, what are the harms that we want to prevent. So first reason is about preventing those harms in high-risk contexts. The second is we've got to acknowledge that AI is not being used today in a regulatory vacuum. There's actually plenty of regulation that applies today to many uses of AI. That regulation is technology neutral. It doesn't matter if you're using AI-enabled software or non-AI-enabled software. That applies in a lot of cross-cutting or horizontal areas of regulation like privacy. If you're using AI, you need to be handling data in accordance with privacy law in the same way that you would be if you weren't using an AI-enabled piece of software. Cybersecurity, other areas in that horizontal sense, it's true as well. And it's true for sectoral regulations too. If we look at financial services, the same regulations that banks have to adhere to in their lending practices are going to apply whether AI is being used or not. So we need to remind ourselves that there is this clear regulatory baseline already, and we shouldn't be proposing to throw that regulation out the window just if AI is being used. Third reason that I think is important is we've got to move beyond an assumption that regulation is going to stifle innovation in this area. In fact, clear and balanced and transparent regulation is really critical for enabling sustained and sustainable innovation. And that ties back to the point I made at the start. If we want AI adoption to grow, if we want that to be done in a way where there's social license and acceptance from citizens that this technology is being used in a responsible way, having clear and balanced regulation is the right way to do that. And developing regulation in innovative ways is a really important way of moving forwards in the context of AI. One thing that we're seeing really interesting approaches to is taking a leaf out of the startup or software world of looking at what you could call a minimum viable product approach to regulation. What's the minimum? What are the minimum baselines that are needed? What are the minimum guardrails that are needed? Regulators can issue that. There can be a process of collaboration and experimentation with industry and other stakeholders, and that can be evolved over time. So we can still regulate, we can still have balanced approaches without just relying on multi-year legislative reform cycles. So hopefully I've convinced you why, from a Microsoft perspective, and I got to say from my personal perspective, regulation has a really important role to play in ensuring AI adoption is done responsibly and on a sustained basis.
Thanks very much, Marcus. Well, if you weren't a high school debating champion, you could have been, because you did one of the great strategies, which is if they make a general argument, you highlight the specific flaws. So when 1C went general, you went bang on to facial recognition. One of the things that I think viscerally does worry people, the sort of real-time biometric surveillance, the sentiment analysis, that starts to become kind of creepy. And that's one of the areas in which I think there's a lot of interest in innovation, a lot of interest in technology, but also a certain wariness. I mean, it's kind of striking that one of the first jurisdictions to ban facial recognition technology was San Francisco, right next to Silicon Valley. And one suspects it's because those people weren't afraid of the thing because they didn't understand it. They were wary of it precisely because they did understand it. So, all right, I was being persuaded that it was industry should take the lead. Now I'm starting to wonder maybe it should be government. And so, look, so Dan, can you bring me back to the light? Help me get some clarity on who should be leading regulation of AI. Dan, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. I certainly not a high school debater, and I've never been one, never envisioned to be one because I'm not really good at doing that. But I mean, I can't agree more with what. So I mean, my stand is to actually pro-industry and see how we can actually get regulation done with the more on the industry side rather than the government side. And I hope I don't actually lose my job after the next 5 minutes or so. I mean, I think Mansi similarly had that the concern as well. But yeah, so I mean, just purely from my personal opinion. So I actually wanted to bring up 3 points, right? I mean, for the next 5 minutes. The first point is, if we were to regulate a particular expertise, how much experience or what's the numbers of years of training do we need? So taking for Simon, for example, right? I mean, he's been practicing for law for the past 30, 40 years, and now he's become the, the AISG, the AI governance, one of the policy maker, and so to speak, right? So I mean, those are the things that we have to understand. If we were to regulate, first we need to understand the domain expertise well. So I mean, going back to the AI pace right now, look at the world right now. What is the digital era are we at now? It's so rapidly that I mean, for the things that you read in the past week, it may actually change this week, right? I mean, it's really rapidly undergoing evolution. I mean, if I wouldn't even be shy to say that we are going from the 4th industrial revolution, we're marching towards the 5th. And if you look at the AI history, it's going from AI, machine learning back in 1980s, and then deep learning started from 2010. And domains-wise, it cut across like image, speech recognition, natural language processing, and then we also have the hardware going from CPUs, GPUs, and TPUs, and now we're talking about quantum computing. What about the telecommunications-wise, right? 4G, 5G, 6Gs, what does it mean? I mean, in the audience-wise, how many of us, if I actually ask you to explain what 6Gs is and what's a TPUs or quantum computing is, how many of us actually understand this? And if you don't understand it well, my question is, how do you regulate this domain well? So, I mean, these are some of the things that we are currently facing from the government, the sector. How do we hire enough experts in the individual domain? I mean, I've mentioned at least 9 to 10 different domains just now. I mean, how do we actually hire these experts within the government sector and to be able to help us to understand first and then to regulate next? So, I mean, the analogy I wanted to give is also, I mean, I gave the first analogy on Simon. The second one is medical school student, if they're actually trying to learn a specialty, the short answer, yes, they can do it. For us as a specialist in healthcare, it takes us 10 years to become a specialist. And then if you actually look at the healthcare space, the medical advancements, sure, it's actually happening really, really fast. But if you look at the AI pace, it's actually 100 or even 1,000 times faster than what is happening in the medical space. How do we keep up? How do we learn enough to regulate? That's point one. Point two is the AI talents around the world. I mean, we know we are having a severe global shortage of AI talents worldwide, right? I mean, most of the talents in my mind is actually densely saturated in the industry, then the government and industry, academia, and the government. So, I mean, why government is the least? Because unfortunately, a lot of the government, we do have some regulation in terms of how much we can pay. So, I mean, whether you like it or not, the pay, the reward, the financial remunerations and stuff is usually the driving factors for the talents to, be lopsided in one field or the other. And look at the tech companies hiring powers, right? MIT grad, Stanford grad, Harvard grad, right? They're all, if they actually, say for instance, in the tech world, if someone actually presented the paper in the NeuroIPS, the top tier conference at their year 3, year 2, they will all be signed up already before they even graduated. Same for Harvard Law School, right? I'm sure Simon actually knows it. If, year 2, year 3 grad, they all sign up in the New York top law firms and Stanford top law firms. No difference in the tech world right now that we are actually looking at. So how do we actually pay them enough to actually come to the government sector and then to be able to help us to regulate? This is something that we are actually facing. I run the AI program in SingHealth, and it's so extremely hard to actually hire AI scientists to actually work within the the government sector. So for us, it's Ministry of Health. So how do we actually making sure that we don't identify the wrong expert, so to speak, to help us to regulate? And sometimes if you actually identify the wrong person, the really disastrous implication for that to happen is you will actually be setting up the wrong policy, hindering and stifling the potential breakthrough innovations that you could potentially achieve, and hence you're actually you're barking up the wrong tree. So I mean, that's the point 2 that I wanted to bring up. And then thirdly is, do we actually need to the regulation, does it actually have to be lopsided to one side or the other, or can collaboration be a solution to it? I mean, so those are the things that I actually also wanted to discuss a little more, right? So how do we leverage each other's strengths to come up with a good policy, and to so that we don't actually miss the blind spot, you know, between the academia, in government or industry, for example? How do we actually mitigate some of the potential or the perceived conflict of interest between the two sides? And how do we actually work as a team to actually, for the greater good, or for the, you know, for the public good? So those are the things that it constantly actually hits me, and it's constantly get me thinking as well. So ultimately, I think the regulation and the governance is really to protect the public interest, and secondarily is to prevent fraud. And while ensuring the safety without compromising or stifling the innovation, I think the close collaboration is always the key between the industry, government, and universities. And I think the last point I really wanted to make is that in order to prepare ourselves to step into the digital era that is rapidly evolving, I think the education and is actually the key as well to build a digitally and AI literate population. Yeah, so those are the 3 points that I wanted to make. Thanks, Simon.
Thanks, Dan. So it's a controversial strategy, being reasonable, saying we should all work together. But in a debating format, we try to force the binary. Another controversial approach by Dan is saying that it's impossible to get good talent in government when one sees sitting right there. But nonetheless, a good presentation, and really highlighting the danger, I think, that bad regulation might arguably be worse than no regulation. And that's something maybe we'll come back to, that if you get the wrong advice or take the wrong step, it can actually be worse than doing nothing, or, as 1C was arguing, waiting until you can get to the right regulatory mix. If you preemptively regulate, all you might achieve is either establishing the wrong incentives or driving innovation elsewhere, given the kind of competitive market that Dan was highlighting. Okay, playing cleanup picture for the against side. Sop, over to you for your take on why the audience was right to start off with, that AI should not be regulated by industry instead of government.
Well, that makes the debate a little easier, but let me put this in context of very different take on why AI should be regulated somehow by government. And as a binary debate, there's no right or wrong answer here. First thing I would argue, saying that, what does AI feed on? What is the diet of an AI? It's data. And as Mitch Kapoor said, if you take data from internet, it's like drinking water from a fire hydrant. It's filled with many things, and you got to figure out what is the right data. So the best way to manage AI is, sometimes you can argue, is to starve it. And who is in the best position to starve it? It is the government. And when I say with a lot of responsibility that there is a better, the government is perhaps better equipped to able to manage the data which gets fed into the AI, which generates the outcome you're looking for. That's the first argument. The second, let's talk about who creates this AI program. Now, and one of the things we talk about, and Simon, you are in the field of law, is that a lot of human beings are aware of the consequence of their actions. And in this case, the people who write program in AI, are they aware of the consequences of their own action? But do they need some kind of guidelines saying that here are the guardrails under which you are expected to talk about explainability of AI? You are expected to be transparent. You are expected to be accountable. You are expected to be ethically constrained in how you write your programs. So that's the second argument around the creator of AI program. And the third argument are the owner of the AI programs. What is their responsibility? Because one thing a regulation can help is to define that boundaries where the owners are accountable for the consequence of the outcome of the AI they're using as part of their business. And it's important to know that there has to be some sense of guardrailing and ensuring that the owners of the AI do understand they're operating within certain constraint. And just to walk the talk, MAS own stance has been not to set a regulation. What instead we have done is to set a guideline where we have said that here are the 4 principles you have to look at: the fairness, ethical choices, accountability, and the transparency. And we have in a way given the guideline for the industry to work within that constraint. So the programs that come as part of their product do reflect some of the constraints we have laid as part of a guideline. So I think there is a strong sense of comfort when on the balance of this balanced activity between industry and the government working on a common outcome, that there is a need for certain set of guided regulation as we understand this space better. I do agree with Daniel saying, look, we may not be fully competent to understand the AI completely, but we can work together with the regulation. We can work together with innovation. And as we are working together, we experiment together. As we experiment together, we build a very thoughtful, responsible regulation together with industry. So in a way, I would argue a close collaborative government-led regulation with inputs from industry, perhaps the best way to look at this topic.
Thanks very much. A great effort appearing again to be the most reasonable person, sort of taking everything on board. But just I love your metaphor of starve the beast. And actually, it does actually recall what's happening in one of the most important jurisdictions for AI, which is China, where China for a long time, I mean, China is now the lead developer of AI, if one counts papers published, patents filed. And a lot of people have concluded that one reason for this is China's access to vast amounts of data, partly because it was a largely unregulated space. But in the course of this year, we've had, in fact, coming into force, I think next week, the Personal Information Protection Act or law in China starting to constrain that, or to turn off the fire hydrant, if you like, or to impose some limits, and some efforts by the Chinese government to rein back in some of the tech companies. The other thing that you were saying, which echoed what Marcus had earlier argued on your side, was that it's wrong to say there's no regulation at the moment, and that companies that these are the owners who use AI, you shouldn't be able to do through AI something that you can't do yourself. And so AI shouldn't provide a kind of legal greenwashing, if you like, to get away with things. Okay, so there are questions coming up in the Q&A, and so you can either ask your questions or you can upvote questions, but I want to come back to each of our panelists with one starting question, and I'll go back to 1C first. So on the when question, 1C, I think you know the Collingridge dilemma. This is this idea put forward by David Collingridge some 40 years ago, that at an early stage of innovation, it's difficult to regulate, and this was your point, because we don't know precisely what the harms are. We don't know the unknowns. We don't know what we will unnecessarily constrain. But if we wait too long, there are sunk costs, there are path determinacies, and it's very hard to regulate because everyone's already moved on. And an example of this maybe is social media, that back in 2004, when Facebook was launched, if we'd foreseen some of the things that we're dealing with now, maybe we would have approached regulating social media a little bit differently. So my question to you is, how long do you want to wait? And when would we get to that sweet spot? Or how would you know when you get to the point where government regulation is appropriate?
Oh, that's a very good question, actually. When will we know that government regulation is appropriate? I think there'll be a few factors driving that. Number one, and really it's what's also happening around the world. I talked about the EU Draft AI Act. China is also looking at regulating AI, but in very, very specific instances and use cases. The US is starting to look at a bill of AI rights, for example, to see how do they address some of the common issues for AI, especially when it pertains to individual freedom and values and so on. So we will, be driven a little bit by one of these external forces when everyone around the world start to coalesce around certain types of regulation. I think that's also will be something that we have to think about so that we do not, number one, fall too far from the curve. Number two, make sure that what we do here in Singapore is also relevant. We want to make sure that everything what the regulations or the governance that we propose is something that allows our companies not just to address the domestic issues, but also be able to address what's happening around the world. So we will need to have something that sort of can balance some of what's happening elsewhere as well. So that's one, right? So when will we do it? When we may have no choice. I mean, I'll be very upfront about this, when we may have no choice, when a lot of other countries around the world are starting to implement. Two, and I think more of internal capabilities perspective, right? We want to make sure that our companies are ready to be able to comply if we do implement regulations, that we have the ability to also make sure that the compliance is enforced. And that actually, we don't see that as being too far away. It may be another, I mean, it is really personal and off the top of my head, right? A couple of years away from being ready. And I agree with Marcus, right? It is really a function of working together with the industry to get to that point, making sure that we are able to learn from one another. And smart regulations, and I'll put it as smart regulations, right? It's not just about protecting the consumers, but it's really about enabling innovation as well. So and we have to do that in lockstep with the industry. And it has to be done also in a very iterative and I suppose short cycle kind of manner, so that you don't take years and years, to pass a law, but rather you learn and then you adjust, you learn and adjust. That's why the guidance and all that is important. Partnerships is important, piloting is important, sandboxing, experimentation is important. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is where Singapore is interesting in a couple of ways. One, in that, I mean, it's a small jurisdiction. Often in areas like this, Singapore will realistically be a rule taker rather than a rule maker. But at the same time, Singapore's unusual, unique political system is such that we can adapt very, very quickly when we want to.
Simon, Simon, can I quickly come with an example here, which
Sure.
perhaps helps to understand this better? In China, you took the example of China. In China, they did not regulate AI. In fact, they regulate the data which gets into the AI. I'll take the example of the financial sector. What China did recently, they set up a utility where they told everybody that whether you're Alibaba or you are a bank, you're going to use the same data set, and that's the rule. And so what they essentially did, they controlled the input, the food of the AI, and then they told, go and use the AI, and that's your competitive advantage. But you are going to use the same set of data so that there's some sense of control on the outcome.
Yeah, I mean, then that's an interesting angle, because there are lots of different ways to regulate. As you highlighted, this is sort of focusing on the raw materials, if you like, and that's a really interesting model. And indeed, it's kind of telling that around the world, efforts to regulate AI have largely tracked data protection approaches for the most part. So the Europeans, obviously, the GDPR has a whole part on automated processing, and unsurprisingly, the EU is at the forefront of hard regulation. America doesn't have a federal data protection regulation at all, and so it's kind of piecemeal and really market-driven approach, whereas China, at least for a long time, focused very much on a kind of sovereignty model. Part of their interest in data is data localization, and sort of making sure that data and AI serve the country. Go ahead, Dan.
Sorry, I just wanted to take this opportunity to just add a few more points on that. The question that you asked just now, I thought is actually quite relevant. When should regulation come in? And if you actually look at the innovation journey as a whole, right? So R&D all the way to implementation for different sectors, I think the regulation should come in when the R&D is about to hit the real world setting. So I mean, why regulation, why governance is to, again, the basic principle is to protect the safety, right? So I mean, so long as the things is about to launch and then about to impact what we do in the activities of daily living, I think that's when regulation should come in. And this also depends on maturity of the different sectors as well. As you can tell, like, the automotive, the driverless cars and things is actually hitting, the space actually quite rapidly. And digital fintech, the fintech space blockchain, for instance, cryptocurrency, how do we regulate that? I mean, this is some of the things that actually differs from country to countries, and also again about the culture of the different countries as well. So I think if you actually regulate too early, and that actually stifles the innovations, how do we actually achieve the balance between the innovations versus the adoption? This is something that, and then Selp actually brought a good point. So is it a regulation or is it a guidelines? So should government come up with the guidelines, and then the regulation comes later, or the regulation should be done by other parties? This is something that I think in the government, in the ministries, this is something that has been also heavily debated. I just want to bring out these 2 points for further considerations. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. So let me turn to Marcus now. Marcus, having complimented you on the strategy of focusing on narrow regulatory questions, I now want to sort of suggest a kind of cynical take on this, which is that companies with a real vested interest, like Microsoft, but many others as well, I mean, it is striking that they are the ones sometimes most vocally calling for regulation. And the cynical take on this is that if you regulate small areas, it leaves the rest. It clarifies the rules of the road so you can push up against those limits. But it also means that in other areas you are not regulated. But if you focus, if you give the government a shiny thing to focus on, like facial surveillance, you can spend time developing the other areas that are not being regulated. Or am I being too cynical?
I think you're being far too cynical, Simon. No, look, for me, it's interesting because it touches on a couple of the questions coming through in the chat. I think one of the principles, there are a couple of principles I think are important to keep in mind. One is the importance of focusing on risk. We do have to acknowledge that there are potentially harmful uses of AI. And I talked about one of those, facial recognition. There are others, Dan, we could talk about healthcare contexts. There are fantastic positive uses for AI in healthcare, but there are certainly some risks of death or serious harm to people if it's used improperly. So in a reality where AI is being used in every industry, in every country across the world, it just makes sense to start with some of the highest risk approaches and focus on those. And then the second, I think, is continuing to remind ourselves that we're not operating in a regulatory vacuum today. It's not necessary to point to the shiny new AI law in a country and say, before that, we had nothing, because it's just not true. And I spoke about some of the examples for that. It doesn't mean that there aren't new challenges created by the use of AI in contexts where there are going to be questions. I was using a non-AI enabled form of software or product before. Now I am using AI. So how do I ensure that I'm complying with anti-discrimination regulation, for example? The bias issues, that just makes it harder. So there's a great space for regulators and industry and other stakeholders to be involved in understanding how to comply with existing regulations and what some of the challenges might be. But we've got to remind ourselves that that regulation is already there. So I think it's two parts to it, Simon. It's focusing on risk just makes sense, and we've got to focus on those areas where there are harms. And then the second is, let's focus on how we enable compliance with the existing regulatory baseline that's already there.
Yeah, I mean, I take your point, Marcus, and indeed one of the advantages of AI, and we're using the term AI quite broadly, as a couple of people have pointed out in the chat, is if you ask an AI system, are you biased? It will usually try to tell you the truth, or you can work out if it's biased. Whereas if you ask a human, did you make a biased decision? No human's going to say, yeah, I'm racist or sexist or whatever. Look, I want to bring in some of the questions from the chat, and I'll sort of indicate a team that might answer this, but really anyone can chip in. And I'll start with a question to the opposition, but also to our government representatives. And this was the most upvoted question from Andre, which I think is a great one. If it's the government's role to regulate AI, who regulates the government? So who'd like to take a stab at that? Go ahead, Sol.
I think this to me, this is a very rhetoric question because that can be said about many things in life. Who regulates government? It's not only AI. You can apply to a whole set of things in our life. Who regulates the government when government is regulating our life? I would say that it's not about who regulates government. It's about who advises government in the right way. It's the industry which will provide the input to the government and saying that here are the data set, here are the set of outcomes we are seeing by using AI. Please take this input and formulate a regulation under which we can all operate in a coordinated way. So it's always the role of the industry to feed the government with the right set of information, and through experimentation or through dialogue or through some kind of mechanism, and hence together we build a better regulated industry.
Yeah, maybe I can come to that as well. I mean, from the government, right? I think I agree with Saab that actually it's not really about who regulates the government, but you phrase the question, maybe phrase the question as how do we know that we're doing regulations in the right way, right? And I agree that actually a lot of it is also from the industry. Companies who are global in nature today, if they find that your jurisdiction doesn't put in place the right laws and the right kind of regulations, they can leave, right? They can move to another jurisdiction, they can operate somewhere else. So that's really important for us to make sure that what we do makes sense for attracting companies to be based out of Singapore, to operate out of here, and two, that we continue to do what makes sense for our companies as well, who wants to be able to sell services to the world, right? And that's why listening to the companies, listening to their issues, understanding and experimenting with them, hearing feedback is important for us. And that's how we know when the regulation is right, is when we start seeing we start seeing companies find that actually Singapore is a good place to do business. I mean, I'm putting it very generally. Yeah.
Yeah. No, right. This is one of the arguments. Sorry, go ahead, Marcus.
No, I just wanted to add something quickly, because I think the question is a really interesting one. If we take a step back just from that question of who regulates the government, because I agree with Sop, that can get a little philosophical. I do think there's a really important role that government can play in leading by example here. And a lot of that's around transparency. How is the government using AI? Building confidence of citizens about the way it's being used. A really interesting example of that from our region is something that New Zealand has done. You know, they've published a compendium of different use cases of, they called it algorithms, but essentially it's uses of AI across government in a full range of contexts, from lower risk to higher risk. And an example like that, I just think it's a great way of leading by example and showing that governments can play a proactive and constructive role.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. I'm just actually going to put in the chat in case people are interested.
Simon, just to take Marcus' point is that, and we have seen this in the blockchain industry, we have seen this in crypto industry, where government plays a proactive, collaborative role. Their response is far better, far more sharper, focused, and more helpful. So more experiment together, better outcome from regulation.
Okay, so that's helpful on the government side, but I want to come to Zach's question about the private sector side. And really, Dan, I'll put you on the spot with this one. So Zach asks, assuming the private sector does take the lead, who would do this? Because in your presentation, Dan, you talked about the importance of public interest. Whose job in the private sector, like, is it to articulate what the public interest is? I mean, Milton Friedman famously said that the business of business is business. Now, that's a pretty old view. These days, we do have the idea of ESG, sort of environment, sustainability, good governance. So business models are changing. But who would be taking the lead? If the government says, no, industry should take the lead, who are they handing the baton to?
Well, I mean, I think this is a very tough question. I mean, who should in the private sector, have the public interest in heart and should actually be driving this? I would go for, this will be a collective decision. If I were to pick from the industry, if I were to form, a group of the consensus group in the industry, this would be something that is should be well represented from different MNCs, small to medium enterprises across all domains. And honestly speaking, I think regulation is a very broad terms as well. When you talk about regulation, it has to be specific. It's no different from, we keep talking about AI for the past half an hour. So, I mean, I can't agree more with the audience. Are you talking about ML? You're talking about DL? You're talking about specific areas? Is it in law? Is it in healthcare? Is it in like space? I think those are the very, very niche area. That's why we are still currently in the narrow AI era, right? I mean, let's talk about AI in general. We're talking about narrow AI. So narrow AI, it means that you need the domain expertise. So cryptocurrency, for instance, right? Vitalik and whatnot. mean, you need those experts to really tell you what exactly is happening with the tech. You can't actually have someone from MAS or like a different, ministry of the finance ministries to say, oh yeah, this is how crypto should be doing. Hey, I mean, get 10 different blockchain developers to follow what you're doing. When this space is rapidly undergoing an evolution. So I mean, those are the things that I also wanted to bring back my first point, right? I mean, how fast is tax happening right now as we just speak? Is a 10 to 10 I mean, there's tons of things is happening as we speak right now. So how do we actually regulate that? And I can tell you today, you ask a lot of different government ministries worldwide, including US, UK, Europe. They can tell you if you actually have just a wine and cheese session, not in the public domain, right? Like now, or, they say, we really don't know how to actually do this because it's happening so fast. I mean, this is something that's happening in a real life setting. So, I mean, I don't think there is a good answers to how we should form, who should drive in the industry. But again, I want to bring back then to my third point, collective decision with a very well represented expert and consensus group, whether is it coming from industry. Hopefully we have the government as an overall approving, but I still wanted to, since it's a debate session, I just wanted to go back to the point that who should be regulating and who's the mastermind, the external advisors that government has been inviting, in all the closed doors, private discussion. How do we actually do this, right? I mean, recently MOH did publish an AI guidelines as well. I mean, a lot of the external advisors has been included. It's not just a government, like 5 people from government to set that guidelines. So who is actually the one regulating behind the scene? But I mean, who's the face fronting that? Of course, that should be the government. But behind the scene, closed door, expert group consensus discussion, who is the one that actually gives all these valuable expert comments? It is something that I feel is truly regulating the AI space. But of course, you need the stamp from the government and say, yes, go ahead and do it. Yeah, so that's my point that I wanted to answer, Simon. Yeah.
Thanks very much. And there are a couple of questions in the chat about representation and so on, making sure that we get the right people at that table. But one C, over to you.
Yeah, thanks.
On this.
Yeah, I thought maybe I just have to frame it in terms of what is the role of the industry in regulating. When you say who in the industry should regulate, actually, there are different parts to it, right? You think of the companies that are adopting the good practices, the good responsible AI practices, right? That's important. These companies can be a small companies, startups, to your big digital and tech firms, right? So that's the adoption side. The industry has a very clear role to play. 2, in terms of developing standards, and that's where Daniel talked about having different expertise, representation, and building consensus. That's also important because the standards development has to come from industry as well. They're the ones who understand the technology best, right? And then 3, in terms of developing capabilities in validating and testing and implementation of AI governance. These are tools, these are solutions, this is technology. That's also something that the industry can participate in. And finally, the last part is really when we want to validate, right? We may need some third-party capabilities in auditing, in testing, in validation, in certification. These are third-party services that the industry can also start to build capabilities in. So these are a full range of different parts that the industry can play in putting in quotes, regulation of AI. Yeah.
Yeah. No, thank you very much. And I think that sort of multifaceted approach to regulation is important. And indeed, that's the essence of what will have to be, I think, the last question I posed to you, because we're heading towards the end of our time. So Ben Tan in the chat, in the Q&A, essentially asks whether we're debating the wrong topic or a narrow topic, because we're focusing on industry or government. And he's saying, well, what about at the global level? Does there need to be some sort of universal standard to regulate AI? So maybe I can go to each of you, whether you hold out any hope for sort of global standards, because this is the challenge for a small jurisdiction like Singapore, that if we're too hot on regulation, too enthusiastic, you drive innovation elsewhere. Too cold on regulation, then we expose the population here to risk. And so it'd be a lot easier if there was a global standard. Do you hold out much hope for that? And any final remarks you want to throw in on this? So maybe I'll go in reverse order through our 4 speakers to give you a chance to respond to that question and offer any last thoughts. So Sok, can I ask you to come in first, having spoken last?
So I think I will draw some lesson from my own journey on when it comes to digital currency and blockchain. So the way we approached a leadership position in this space is by being the first one to put an experiment out in the on the open, where we brought the industry together and start understanding the space better, whether it's digital currencies or DLT. And what it leads to a global opportunity for us from a global forum to come to Singapore and start working with us in framing certain global standards when it comes to in those two areas of technology. Just to as a data point, Singapore became a big hub of both from a BIS, which kind of central bank, to set up an innovation lab in Singapore to decide the future of regulation in this space. So if you talk about the AI side, the same thing will happen. I think Singapore should, in this space, take a big example from the industry, build a consortium, set up an experiment, and hopefully that marquee experiment will bring the global audience together to share a progressive regulation in this space. I think it's already happening. There's a project called NOVA, I know from my sector, where we are bringing the whole industry consortium and various central bankers together to formulate certain thoughtful reaction to AI as it gets implemented in the sector. And just quickly close my point, we also start differentiating between this narrow AI and expansive AI. This is a key to the argument, because in my mind, the narrow AI is all operational AI. It solves an operational inefficiency we have today. It is well regulated today, no doubt about it. The second bucket, which is about the expansive, insightful, decision-making AI, that needs a further thought process, more experiment before you think about regulation.
Okay, all right, thanks. Dan, a response on the global question and any last comments from you?
Thanks, Simon. I mean, yeah, thanks to share from the finance point of view. I also personally have the healthcare perspective to share. So, I mean, globally, I think there's already a lot of different guidelines happening in US FDA and European CE mark to actually regulate. Previously, right now they're regulating all sorts of different diagnostic devices and drugs, new drugs that comes out in the market. And now AI has also been treated as a software, as a medical device guideline. So SAMD guidelines, that's been published in US FDA back in 2018. And basically, personally, I'm actually sitting in a few international AI committees to actually look at how AI in healthcare should be regulated, or actually, in fact, should be reported, So the reporting guidelines, Consort AI and Spirit AI, this is something that is led by the UK group, the Equator guidelines, and now they have the AI extension, the version to see when an AI developer is trying to build AI algorithms for healthcare, what are some of the 25 different items that you have to tick before you can even publish it in a good journal, before the US FDA, before the European CE mark is going to approve that. There's another group that in Oxford also looking at Decide AI. So how the interaction between the AI and the human factors should come in to actually impact on the final decision. So assistive decision, that what Sop has mentioning. So AI generally is autonomous and semi-autonomous. So basically assistive. So basically this is in the healthcare space, this is how the internationally speaking people are actually looking at it. WHO also have a digital health guidelines that I will encourage the audience to read up. There's a lots of different the international AI guidelines, consensus guidelines already happening in the healthcare space, and there's more coming out on the AI ethics, the responsible AI. So what is AI ethics, bias, and how do you explain the AI and the XAI settings? So those are the things. Is a lot of things are underway. So just to share, from the healthcare space as well. Thanks, Simon.
Yeah, thanks. I think both you and Sop have really highlighted one of the challenges I think we're realizing now is that you don't just need sort of three laws of robotics or 5 ethical AI principles. You need to work on how it applies in particular sectors to particular technologies. Marcus, last comments from you, either on the global question or just final thoughts.
Look, I think the global question is a really important one, and I love the comments from Dan and Sop already. I think going back to that idea of the spectrum of types of regulation that Wansi is talking about, we're not going to get a universal global law on the use of AI, and so it's unrealistic, frankly, to aim for that. But I think this kind of cooperation to define common standards in individual industries for how AI is going to be used, that, that's a really fruitful area for cooperation. We're also seeing some really positive work in the international standards setting bodies like the ISO on specific parts of the use of AI. Okay, if I want to debias a particular system, what are some of the good practices I can apply? So I think there's really great potential for global approaches in some of those specific standard setting bodies as well. So lots to do. And I think I'm sure we're all convinced that government and industry should be working together, because we've all been far too balanced and sensible.
No, the debate format is breaking down. 1C. Come on, bring it back, show how you've won and the other guys are completely wrong.
Okay, I shall not do that, but I actually do agree with what they are saying. But I wanted to talk a little bit about global standards. And I think I agree with Marcus that it's, to get alignment in terms of regulatory approach across all countries is going to be very, very difficult. But then what are we aspiring to here, right? For me, I think if I can get interoperability across different jurisdictions, and that's really, again, thinking about it from the perspective of the companies that are operating out of Singapore, whether you're an MNC or a domestic or a local company, right? If I can get interoperability, that means if what you do in Singapore allows you to also be able to sell your products and services around the world, then that's really important. But what does interoperability entail, right? And that's really about coming up with common definitions. EU is looking at a risk-based approach to AI regulation. So we need to have a common approach to what is the definition of risk. How do you classify AI systems? How do you do a common risk assessment? So that whether or not it's a requirement to comply with to do conformity testing, for example, like in EU, or it's a function of just demonstration of your ability to meet these requirements, this would be very helpful for companies. So interoperability is what we are striving for right now. And then what's Singapore doing in that space? Number one, we are participating in all the national, international, all the necessary international platforms to try and push our point across. But two, it's really about running faster and thinking deeper about this topic and putting out very specific points of view. We've done that with the Model AI governance framework. We work very closely with the companies, not just in Singapore, but around the world, to refine that. That provides a very clear point of view, and that really put us in terms of on the map, in terms of thinking about AI governance very early on. But we need to continue to move ahead and move faster. And that's something that I think that's really the call out to our friends in the industry today to work with us, to look at the next step in terms of what we have to do for developing more thought leadership in AI governance. Yep.
All right, well, look, thank you, all of you. I mean, what you've really demonstrated is that the debate format clearly is an artificial one. It's sometimes criticized in the schools context because it forces people to say things are black or white when actually they're gray. But the more you debate and the more you take part in these discussions, you'll end up arguing both sides, and you realize that there are lots of shades of gray. And I think our panelists have demonstrated not the simplicity of their case, but the complexity of this set of issues. All that said, audience, you do have to say black or white. So I want to, if we can get Brian to pull up the questionnaire. We've got two questions for you only. Do you agree that AI should be regulated by industry, not government? And who made the stronger case in this case? And I assume we're saying that team government is the opposition in this case, and so the team in favor of industry, so that the two would be flipped around. So yes, AI should be regulated by industry. So you're arguing on that, you're making a decision on the substance, but then who you thought made the better argument today. So we'll do that very quickly while I thank our four speakers. I mean, really, rather than representing a side, they're representing some of the thought leaders in the field. We've got 1C from government, we've got Marcus from industry, if you like, we've got Dan representing health, and Sop representing wealth. These are some of the key areas in which AI is already making a difference and clearly will make a difference. And one of the challenges I think we're all trying to grapple with is how to get the obvious benefits of that while mitigating the risks. And underlying that is a question we're actually looking at in AI Singapore, just a little plug for that, that we're trying to do two things in the AI governance framework. One, supporting this idea of how we ensure that AI is trustworthy, that it is worthy of trust, that it's safe, secure, and so on. But also trying to work out what it is that will actually affect individual human decisions as to whether or not they will in fact trust AI. What will shape those human-machine interactions that are going to be so important in the near future. All right, so let's close the poll and see what the result is. See whether did this debate change anyone's mind? Oh, it appears you cannot have a tie. A tie, that's ridiculous.
I think it is the AI machine who did the outcome.
Yes.
That's called responsible AI.
So maybe that is the best possible result, that we understand the complexity, we understand that this requires partnership, and that we understand this requires the insights and the perspectives of all the people at this table, but also tuning in today through SGInnovate. So on behalf of SGInnovate and the National University of Singapore Faculty of Law, thanks very much for your involvement as participants. Thanks for your great questions. And in particular, please join me in a virtual round of applause for our 4 panelists. And I'll hand it back to Brian from SGInnovate.
Thank you so much, Simon. So thank you to all our panelists today, Sop, Dan, Marcus, and Rans here for their insightful and knowledgeable arguments. I think I can speak for SGInnovate's behalf to say that it was a pleasure to have a group of star-studded experts like yourself here today to share your insights on such an important topic. Special thanks to Simon as well for moderating the session and for his help with putting the event together. So unfortunately, we weren't able to cover all of your questions due to time constraints, but I also very much like to thank our audience for engaging with us and sending in your questions. So we will also be sending out a post-event email with important information, including a recording for this webinar. So do keep an eye out for that. And with that, we've come to the end of our webinar today. Thank you all for spending a Tuesday morning with us. And on behalf of SGInnovate, I would like to wish you all a great week ahead, and we look forward to seeing you again at our next event. Bye. Bye, everyone. Thank you so much for this great session.